My name is Frederick April. I am a cinematographer by profession, and was the closest friend of the master film director Thomas Narath. We worked together throughout college on short films, and eventually collaborated on his internationally famous zombie movies, beginning with Their Billion Hands, released in 2007. Their Billion Hands took Thomas 3 years to write and shoot. It looked at a zombie plague from the perspectives of 11 different characters in a montage of grisly violence and carefully crafted human drama. The movie was a seamless dazzle, beginning with the plague's freakish beginnings in a condemned Serbian church, and progressing through agonizing war room arguments which forced the American government to scorch the earth in desperation. From a paranoid senator with early signs of Alzheimer's to a woman whose hopes for freedom from an abusive husband were pinned on the growing chaos, the characters felt real, and their points of view felt unique. Thomas's ultimate thesis was that mortal fear, global upheaval, and anarchy were the universe's naturally cleansing agents, both historically necessary and irrevocable. It was his pure expertise with cinema, though, that offered the moment-to-moment gruesome thrills. His zombies were awful to look at, and their violence was unpredictable, the results of it positively horrifying. The camera had never had such dark fascination with zombie violence, and the threatened humanity of those who were forced to engage in it. The ending left viewers queasy with its gore even as it compelled them with its opulence of imagination, as hundreds of the living dead sinking into the ocean grabbed vengefully at the flailing survivors of a gunboat wreck. With this film, Thomas Narath launched himself to success and stardom, having produced a masterpiece in a genre he had no real interest in, other than for its metaphorical value. It became clear to me during the filming that this was a man who could make any story into something memorable through the force of his intellect and his great observation to detail. When it was all over and all the profits were counted, I expected Thomas to tell me he was ready to start shooting the period drama about the Roman Senate he had been planning for years. We went our separate ways for a year or so after Their Billion Hands opened, keeping in touch via email about our ideas. To my surprise, Thomas, whose interests included everything from music composition to collecting baseball cards, eventually decided there was more story to tell involving the living dead. The sequel to Their Billion Hands was entitled The Language Demons Speak, and it was creative almost to a fault, as much a masterpiece as the first film. This one was set during the height of the zombie plague, as the undermanned 3rd Assigned Army hunkered down on the Maryland-Pennsylvania border in preparation for a fiery assault. Through bad decision-making, hubris, and paralyzing fear, the military minds running the encampment condemned it to a state of siege, as thousands of the living dead seemed to prepare their own intelligent counterattack in the surrounding hills. The parallels Thomas drew between this situation and the agonizing days of the U.S. Marines at Khe Sanh were at first subtle, but then grew more and more daringly obvious. The first hour and a half was like a twisting rubber band drawing the tension and suspense tighter and tighter, as evidence of increasing zombie atrocities was shown, but the zombies themselves never were. The day-to-day struggles of soldiers trying to keep sane in the face of madness were relentlessly detailed, to the point where there seemed little difference between Glad Hill, Pennsylvania, and Vietnam. By the time the breaking point came, the men of the so-called End Times unit had become completely rounded, deeply flawed characters whose fate the audience absolutely had to know. Then came the coup de grace, as Thomas jerked the story sideways into the snow-blanketed hills to follow the relentless progress of a severely wounded zombie whose identity remained a conundrum even after one left the theater. We shot in conditions of zero visibility during the blizzard of 2010. Thomas had me turn the screen into a blindingly white canvas, which made the face of the mystery zombie that much more sinister and expressive. The language demons speak was another huge critical and commercial hit in 2011. Privately, I was a little disappointed that during the end of the editing stage, Thomas inserted on the screen a Wallace Stevens quote, which seemed to open up the possibility of a third film, making it officially a trilogy. The financial reward for me, should a third be shot, would be considerable. But I wasn't crazy about an auteur like Thomas, spending so much of his early career in this genre. But then, we thought we had our whole lives ahead of us. In 2013, we shot The Grave of Terence Nin, the conclusion of Thomas Narath's celebrated zombie trilogy. Against all studio pressure, fan desires, and seemingly solid logic, Thomas chose to close his classic zombie trilogy by reducing the story in both size and scope. The story followed an openly racist white veteran of the infamous Battle of Gladhill, which closed the second chapter so memorably, as he made his way via motorized wheelchair to a fabled zombie-free zone in Tennessee. Along the way, his repeated encounters with a single dark-skinned zombie laid the foundation for a comedic and ultimately poignant two-man movie, as the survivor's tangled moral sense kept him from killing the source of his angst. If you found yourself rooting for the survival of poor dead Terence Nin, you weren't at all alone. His ultimate fate left so many people in tears upon the film's release that a Best Picture nomination came as no real surprise. The film's final act brought the overall story arc to a close by introducing a cast of psychologically damaged characters who represented American archetypes, corrupted and somehow purified by the 3-year nightmare of the living dead's hold upon the land. Their methodical planning for a mass crucifixion as a miracle cure for the plague played out as black comedy, given a lingering pathos by the much-talked-about final shot, the one that took us a month to get right. Held for more than 4 minutes, and involving the complex choreography of over 1,000 living dead extras, it gave a careful viewer plenty of time to figure out and appreciate just why Thomas ended the trilogy with this rigorous ballet. What remained in the memory most was the fearlessness of a filmmaker who took the strangest genre imaginable and used it to create true art, not just once, but 3 times. To my relief, Thomas was finally done with Zombies Forever, and he actually threw a lavish party to celebrate the fact, retiring to his farm in upstate New York for 6 months, right afterward, to think about other projects and work on his music, which had always been his second love. I was in great demand as a cinematographer, almost entirely due to the success of the trilogy, and Thomas and I kept in touch over the next few years through occasional emails and phone calls, him always talking up some new idea for a movie which never seemed to get past the script stage, and I very much looking forward to working with him again. Meanwhile, the temptation for the studio to cash in on Thomas's trilogy was just too great. The French action director Chris-Luc Harard helmed Their Billion Hands 4, and while he wasn't a bad choice, the scriptwriters just weren't up to the task of building upon what had come before. A cast cobbled together from the first 3 films played a UN rescue team trapped in the remains of a Rwandan refugee camp while a sea of zombies inexplicably surrounded them. A week-long project to tunnel to freedom turned into a year of mysterious indecision as the tunnel became a never-ending maze from which no one seemed to have the courage or even desire to emerge. Despite this intriguing premise, the efforts to salute Thomas Narath's ability to add multiple thematic dimensions to his plots bordered on camp, and Harard substituted meaningless random zombie attacks for real suspense. The movie was a failure that didn't quite tarnish the trilogy. The same could not be said for Their Billion Hands 5. Everything about this sequel was relatively half-baked. In this entry, the American government's efforts to quash the living dead involved dropping the occasional nuclear weapon, resulting in widespread fallout which gave birth to a new species of nasties. These walking corpses talked, and even their verbal sludge was usually more interesting to listen to than the human cast, which was headed up by some sitcom star. Based on the relative success of Part 4 in the series, this one hung around for a few weeks in the theaters before vanishing quietly. Meeting up with Thomas for the first time in a year at the Cannes Film Festival, we had a couple of drinks, and I could tell he was becoming increasingly bothered by the franchising of his work, though he seemed happy otherwise, entrenched as he was in writing a script about the life of the activist John Brown. That one, too, after 20 drafts, was laid to rest as Thomas kept trying to find that one project which would truly captivate him. His one real wish for the next decade was that there simply would be no Their Billion Hands 6. But sadly, it wasn't to be. The next film in the now interminable series, released in 2018, wasn't even screened for critics, always the kiss of death. The movie came out on Thomas Narath's birthday, 11 years after his original classic. By now, we didn't even mention the corruption to his trilogy when we corresponded. Just when it seemed he was ready to shoot an adaptation of Stephen King's Dark Tower cycle, going so far as to prepare to meet with me to start shooting second unit footage, he hit yet another creative snag and stalled. I still wasn't completely worried for him, though. After all, when a movie called Their Billion Hands Gene Pool was released straight to streaming internet video, he was still only 42 years old, a young man. This latest mistake was nothing more than a jumble of hotties in their early 20s being trained to kill zombies in space. The good news was that the unprofitability point of this franchise, which was never meant to be one, had finally been reached, and it was never taken up again. Or who knows, maybe it would have become a TV series or something, had the world not suddenly changed so dramatically, so awfully 2 years later, on January 9th, 2021. My friend Thomas Narath and I finally came together to work on a project again in spring of the year 2023. We were both older, a little wiser, but there would be no joy in what we were doing. No inspiration, genre bending, or creative discovery. Just a dogged determination on Thomas's part that we act. Our project was a documentary entitled The End of the Human Son. He'd conceived the idea over the previous 6 months of surviving day to day in a catastrophically altered America which mirrored his darkest creative visions. It was the first major documentary about what first struck the world in 2021 like a terrible dream come to life. Impossible but true. Unthinkable but everywhere around us. In our film, talking heads debated its cause, single mothers sheltered their children inside gymnasiums and abandoned nightclubs. The world's armies overstepped their bounds in ever more sophisticated and politically expedient ways, and America slowly became the hallucinatory prison we know today. Thomas, working under a sense of obligation, then dug deeper than all of that, and he took his time doing so. The 2-part, 5-hour program made for public television got closer to the undead than most people ever had. The scenes of Thomas and I trapped by zombies inside a moving van for 6 hours because of one miscalculation too many brought the terror of the situation too close to home for some, my wife in particular, and one outburst of violence against 2 6th graders at Potsdamer Platz in Berlin should simply never have been shown to anyone. We went back and forth over the necessity of that footage for weeks. The madness of what we now faced every day was crystallized best in the documentary's most controversial scene, in which Thomas, one sound man, and I, with the secret and completely unauthorized cooperation of a heartbroken soldier, filmed the day spent inside the killing rooms at Warrenton Proving Grounds in Southern Virginia. Our footage finally confirmed the existence of sizable zombie pens maintained to teach men how to kill the dead with their bare hands. Behind locked doors 70 feet underground, that rebellious and now AWOL soldier showed us the tricks he'd learned, and almost died in the process. For the first time, Thomas Narath was seen on screen, gaunt and unable to smile, A very different man from the gregarious chap who had made the definitive fictional version of the phenomenon which would later destroy us. In the editing room, I was compelled to watch one particular moment dozens of times. We were in the rural house of a woman named Ellen Sheegan, interviewing her about the death of her husband. She was in the middle of responding to one of Thomas's questions when our sound man, Enzio Cardinale, could be heard in the background saying, I'm sorry. Please listen for a moment." The camera kept rolling as we all fell silent. At first there was nothing, but then we heard a soft thud from downstairs. Ellen Sheegan looked at the four of us in the room and asked if anyone had left a door open downstairs. Enzio started to leave the room and the sound went dead. I lifted the camera and followed him to the top of the staircase. Enzio called out but got no response. It was at that point that I briefly swung the camera around to see if Thomas was behind me. The expression on his face was one of such sorrow, such exhaustion, that I found myself watching that moment more than any other in the film. He had reached his breaking point. Downstairs in Ellen Keegan's house, a deer had actually wandered in, not something terrifying at all. It didn't matter, though, the damage was done. None of us could focus for the rest of the night. We eventually got the full interview, for whatever it was worth. With the country torn apart physically and psychologically, and every fourth person unable to function normally due to undiagnosed shock, it was questionable what could be gained from watching the end of the human sun. More likely future generations will, if we ever emerge from our ongoing nightmare, clamor to it as a professional, thorough, and riveting document of madness. But today it feels to me, despite its technical excellence, nothing more than redundant, masochistic punishment. It took Thomas and I a year to shoot it. After it was done, Thomas disappeared again, back to his farm in North Collins, New York, but this time almost without a word. He had become depressed, withdrawn, and frightened. He realized that he might now not ever get the chance to direct a movie he truly wanted to, that he would forever be identified as a horror filmmaker and nothing more. More importantly, though, of course, he feared for the safety of himself and his wife. Our brushes with danger during the shooting of The End of the Human Sun had damaged him more deeply than any of us realized. I wouldn't see my friend and colleague again until November 9th, 2025. Last summer, a director named Aaron Loomis released a documentary about his life, entitled The Mirror in the Barn. It began with his wife's recollection of how Thomas would, most mornings on their later stays at the farm, walk down to the bank of the pretty little creek nearby to work on a song, but come back with sketches of zombies. Such was the curse, the documentary explained, of good-hearted Thomas, a poet and musician who long ago had an idea for a story about the living dead and a faithful connection at a small movie studio. His wildly successful zombie trilogy made him rich and famous, then doomed him to remorse, as real-life events cut off all escape from his old identity. The accolades he won for his work made studios line up to offer him the freedom to try something new, but he never did. For years after the apex of his career, he lived contentedly with his wife on 12 acres of farmland, largely indifferent to the taint that other men's shoddy sequels cast upon his trilogy. Then came 2021, and he was forced, like the rest of us, to watch the cruelest fate imaginable descend upon the earth. In The Mirror in the Barn, his wife, Donna, described the onset of his depression in a voice that seemed cloaked with a permanent soul sickness of her own. In December of 2023, Thomas's niece was severely burned trying to evade an attack during her birthday party. And just a day later came the Golden Gate Bridge disaster. But the fact that reanimated corpses had actually come to threaten humanity was somehow no more disturbing to Thomas than the belief that his imagination had betrayed everyone who had watched his work, that his imagination had insulted the gravity of the new situation. At one time utterly convinced that his vision of a hypothetical apocalypse was the definitive one, the truth that real zombies were 10 times more terrifying, the havoc set loose on his country 20 times more surreal, brought paralyzing guilt to his heart. There was no comic relief, no thematic subtlety, no art to the real carnage. He had been caught playing imagination games. Good ones, everyone had always said, with something whose reality left no room for such hubris. The actor who became a star because of the trilogy, Grant Estanovich, had a small but vital part in the documentary. A sadly suspenseful 8 minutes of screen time were devoted to him tracking down an old videotape of he and Thomas drunkenly musing on the mind-bending cause of the real plague, at the end of which Thomas broke down in tears over the inadequacy of his trilogy to depict the simple, nightmarish truth of a real zombie's face. As the plague raged on, he spent entire days not filling up notebooks with movie ideas, as he once did as a man in his 20s and 30s, but with tireless zombie watching, a pair of binoculars and a sketchbook ever present. Most chillingly, Thomas's last possessions were found to include a letter from an Arkansas woman who accused his very artistic presumption of bringing the dead down upon us. It seemed no matter where he turned, he was reminded of the way his art tried to imitate life, but instead could only produce an embarrassing facsimile, once revered and later scorned. It wasn't surprising that his depression reached its nadir shortly after the completion of The End of the Human Son. I still remember the writhing, headless surgeon shown in the opening shot of that film, and probably so do you. It's understandable one might recall that and yearn to burn every frame of Thomas's 3 epics in pitiless frustration. Toward the last days of his life, Thomas disowned those works, and found strange solace in repeated viewings of the last 3 sequels of the Billion Hands series, whose B-movie silliness offered an escapist release from the horrors going on outside his window. He told me over the phone that this was the way he should have made the stuff from the beginning, dumb and harmless. With Aaron Loomis's documentary, at least, his humanity was finally somewhat detached from the awful legacy of the Time of the Living Dead. There are some facts about Thomas's death which Ms. Loomis would certainly have wanted to include in her admirable work, and which only I was privy to. I'm speaking here of what happened on November 9th, 2024. I will describe here the incident as best I can, for therapeutic reasons mostly. I could, I suppose, make a movie myself someday, a short addendum to The Mirror in the Barn, something to close the story as it needs to be closed, but I can't see myself ever doing it. Let this be the only record of my experience. Thomas went missing one day from the apartment he shared with his wife in Boston, having left a note saying simply that it was time to go. Donna felt immediately that it was a suicide note, and called me because I was geographically closest to their North Collins farm during that time, taking care of my ailing mother just 100 miles away. It was during this conversation with Donna that I finally became aware of how deep Thomas's depression had become. I immediately drove the 2 hours to the farm on Donna's suspicion that maybe he had gone there. On the way, I had to negotiate my way past a roadblock. A containment squad had set up there briefly in order to quarantine a small church. There were 3 jeeps parked outside of it, and 2 CSNs were standing and smoking on the steps of an adjoining gift shop, which sold handmade crafts and foods. They peered inside intently while one man spoke into a radio. In a sloping field behind the building, 2 more CSNs were walking towards someone who was strangely sitting in a wooden chair, all alone and facing away from the squad, about 100 yards away, right there on the grass. They had their guns ready. I looked away, anxious to not see. The road ahead was marked with a yellow sign, meaning that it was for the moment passable only in the case of an emergency. I explained bluntly to one of the CSNs what my emergency was, and he let me through. Between then and my arrival at the farm, I had one frightening moment. The sun was going down behind a vast expanse of woods that stretched 10 miles on either side down the curvy country road I was traveling. I heard a ratcheting sound somewhere toward the front of my car, and it bucked a bit. I pulled over right away on the dirt shoulder and let the car idle there for a moment, suddenly terrified. I was in the middle of nowhere. With the car in park, I gunned the engine for a while, pleading with God to keep it running. I pulled back onto the road, and there was no further incident. Looking to my left and right at the darkening woods as I drove, the thought of getting stuck there and not being able to see what might be around me sunk into my brain and nested there for the rest of the journey. Between then and my arrival at the farm, I saw nothing and no one. Thomas's farm was reachable by navigating a twisting dirt lane leading back through parallel rows of trees. I got there at exactly 6 o'clock, and it was full dark. I parked in front of the ramshackle house he'd never improved. It was more than 100 years old and falling apart in 100 little ways. I didn't see any of the cars around. I climbed the porch and knocked on the front door, but there was no answer. True to form, no one had locked the door, so I went in. The house was completely dark. I called out Thomas's name, but there was only silence. Not even the ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. It must have stopped at some point and never been fixed. I made myself check the kitchen, turning some lights on. There was no sign that anyone had been here. With a real sense of dread, I climbed the stairs leading to the bedrooms. I had my cell phone in my right hand as I went. I was supposed to call Donna as soon as I could establish that Thomas wasn't here. The door to the master bedroom was shut tight. I tapped on it twice and got no response. I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The bed inside appeared to have been slept in, though the covers hadn't been pulled back. They were rumpled, though, uneven. I left the room. Down the hall was a guest bedroom where I had stayed a couple of times over the years. It, too, was empty. Through its window, I looked out on the rear of the property, and the little barn out there, sitting at the end of a path beaten through the grass. A light was on inside it, the faintest glow. I knew I would have to enter it. Back in the kitchen, I noticed something on a little table in a breakfast nook. Beside a vase of flowers, there was a small clump of dirt and grass, obviously from outside, sitting on the table's wooden surface. I touched it. The grass was the same temperature as the room, no way of telling where this fistful had come from, or when it had been pulled from the earth. I tried to ponder its meaning, but my mind was too much in chaos. I flipped the light switch above the sink to cast a sickly yellow glow on the yard, and I left the house through the back door and walked toward the barn. The doors leading inside it were closed. I stopped in my tracks when I heard something off to my right. It was only the sound of twigs and leaves turning over all around me as the wind rose. But these days, that's all it takes to raise the hackles on my neck. To stop and look around and make sure I'm not alone. The psychologists call it pinprick awareness. Everyone's had it since the beginning of the nightmare. I had to really put my shoulder into pushing the barn doors inward. The light was from a lamp set on a rickety wooden table, the one where Thomas sometimes set his laptop when he was composing some music out here. A car was parked inside the barn, a relatively new Volvo I hadn't seen before. Its driver's side door was open. I moved around to the front of the car and looked inside. The keys were in the ignition. There was nothing and no one in the passenger seat or the back seat. I slid behind the wheel. The keys were turned to the on position. I switched them back and tried to restart the car. Immediately, I recognized the sound of an engine completely starved for gas. I got out of the car, shaking. I went around to the back of it and saw what I had been dreading. There were swatches of cloth, torn up bath towels, it turned out, jammed into the exhaust pipe. I wondered how long it would have taken Thomas to die if he had remained in the car, if the asphyxiation would even have worked, given the size of the barn. I just didn't know. Maybe he had given up. Maybe it had come to nothing and he had left the barn. I turned off the lamp and plunged the barn into darkness, and then I left it. I staggered back to the house, crying, the tears freezing on my cheeks, and I entered the kitchen again. I crossed through into the dark dining room and slumped in one of the stiff-backed wooden chairs around the table, hanging my head, squeezing my eyes shut. After 5 minutes like that, I looked through the wide picture window at the little barn in the distance, at the leaves rolling across the grass, at the tiny stripe of purple over the horizon. I had left the floodlight on, showing me dead grass and skeletal leaves. I called Donna and told her that Thomas was not here at the farm. I told her I would drive to her tonight and that we would figure out what to do next. Then I actually put my head down on the table, enclosing it in my arms like a child at school disciplined for being bad, and I sat like that until I was overcome by fatigue, and it was right there that I fell asleep. Or rather, my brain knocked me out to protect me for just a little while from stress and fear. I was out for a little more than an hour, I think. When my eyes opened, I at first didn't even know where I was, but then it all came rushing back to me. How I was the only human being for a mile in any direction, searching for my friend. I raised my head and looked at the pictures on the wall beside the dining room table, trying to focus. Donna had painted these in happier days, images of the countryside in summertime. My arms tingled uncomfortably, and I looked down to see the short hairs on them were standing on end. I felt a presence nearby. Nervously, I called out Thomas's name. There was no answer. I turned then and looked straight ahead through the picture window, out onto the land behind the house. Thomas Naroth stood on the cold back lawn of his old farmhouse, perfectly still in the floodlight's pool of weak yellow and orange, looking back at me through the window. He wore a red flannel shirt, tattered slacks, black tennis shoes. I cannot say how long he had been dead, but it had been more than a day, certainly. Even from a distance I could see that his head had become grossly enlarged and misshapen, as had his hands, which were now twice the size of a normal man's, the fingers almost like tentacles. His feet, too, were undoubtedly severely bloated to the point where he would have trouble balancing on them. One of his arms, his left, was raised high above his head and cocked strangely, but utterly without intent. His muscles had spasmed and completely locked that way, so that the arm was nothing more than a useless branch protruding from him, rigid, immobile. His hair, instead of falling out, had already sprouted and grown much longer than he had ever worn it in life. It was completely gray and hung down in front of his blackened face, which was now unrecognizable, his features mutated and pushed outwards as if a tiny explosion had occurred inside his skull. The face had, predictably, begun to split raggedly down the middle, the flesh hanging loosely and messily as if pasted on. In another 2 or 3 days, the thing that was once Thomas would begin to claw at that flesh, and it would slide off the skull bit by bit. By then his entire body would have bloated to the point of bursting his clothes, and on day 6 or 7 it would start to collapse back in on itself. First his ankles would shrink and become too spindly to support his weight, and he would fall to the ground, never to rise again. His entire lower body would shrivel, day by day, until his waist was half the circumference it used to be, and his vital organs would detach and settle into his stomach, puffing him out there. At that point, all that would move would be his head and his arms, reaching out to sink long, curling fingernails into anything that passed. Those fingernails, now an inch long, would grow to a length of 5 or 6 inches if nothing stopped them. His eyes would be sunken so deep into their sockets that it would seem as if he had none. His head, becoming something more like a rotting pumpkin, would weigh so much compared to the rest of him that his neck wouldn't be able to lift it anymore. Finally, his movements would simply cease, and he would be no more. For now, though, he stood, 80% blind, 80% deaf. He seemed to see me, but this wasn't possible. If he had seen me, he would have walked forward, sensing that a living thing was nearby. He would try to kill me by strangling me with his one working hand, and because he was unable to control the intensity of his grip, he would keep tightening it until my throat was completely crushed and the remnants of his own brain began to burst. He would keep strangling me long after I was dead. The sheer effort of it would cause his body to rupture in a dozen places, and his blood would pour out of them as if through a paper bag, and he would cease to be just as I had, until I myself began to rise. With his last bit of strength, he may or may not crawl on top of me, open his mouth, and use it to search out my tongue, biting it off and then attempting, probably unsuccessfully, to swallow it. These were the details Thomas Neroth had never imagined 15 years before, but which were real to us now. I got up out of my chair and I looked at him through the window, placing one hand on the cold pane. He didn't move. The wind rocked his body gently. His head, so bulbous and top-heavy with the sickness of the undead that it tilted grotesquely to one side, shook ever so slightly. He could not be identified had his own wife stood before him. I only knew it was him because of that red flannel shirt. He had a dozen of them. Seconds passed, and then Thomas's right foot lifted ever so slightly, and he placed it a few inches forward. When it connected with the ground, he almost fell over, then righted himself. His brain recalculated, planning the next step. Eventually, it would work well enough to keep him moving. But I would be gone by then. I waited no longer to move. I went through the house and I drove away from the farm, but not before I turned off the lawn floodlight, leaving Thomas Neroth in the darkness he craved. My last image of him was of a silhouette in the moonlight, standing there, one arm above his head, motionless, rooted in place until his brain sent him some sort of signal to move, a signal which might never have come, but it did. They still haven't found Thomas, who could have done himself in by shotgun or leaping from a high ledge or even drowning, giving him a chance to remain still wherever he died. Instead, he chose, out of crushing guilt perhaps, a method of suicide that would certainly leave him undead. Everyone knows of the suicide attempt. I couldn't lie and say there hadn't been one. I saw Thomas 9 days ago, and by now peace has come for my friend, surely. Donna obviously suspects I hold a secret I'll never reveal, not to her, and certainly not to anyone else, least of all a once ravenous movie-viewing public to whom the word zombie, at one time a source of entertainment and intrigue, has instead become the blackest profanity the universe has ever borne.